You don't have to call Zelensky a dictator to say that there's a question of what is Ukrainian public opinion. I heard you recently saying, I think to Studebaker, like, well, how well formed is public opinion in the Ukraine, given the exile of millions and given the lack of free speech rights and the attack on opposition parties and civil society institutions and media, etc.
All right, well, welcome to the Spencer Leonard Hour. With me on the Spencer Leonard Hour is Spencer Leonard's clone. No, it's actually Spencer Leonard. You're lucky today. Historian, platypus, founder, and sometimes a bane of my existence, but mostly not lately. Spencer, welcome to your own show.
Thanks, Doug. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So we're going to be talking about the concept of the labor aristocracy, and I want you to inform me about the history of that idea. It's a notion that I find kind of has an intuitive sense to it. It doesn't seem completely like insane, but it seems to be abused quite a lot. So why did you bring up this idea as the primary topic of conversation this week?
I mean, I think that this is a topic that gets to obviously we have a kind of a resurgent. It's late and it's kind of dying or maybe a little reluctant now, but still the last big movement on the left, such as it is, let's assume it's the left, was the pro-Palestinian movement. And a lot of the discontent on the left with the big attempt of the post-Bernie years, the DSA, there's a lot of discontent with the DSA now. Mm-hmm. And that spawned a lot of neo-Stalinism, right, and kind of a new sectarianism, like breaking with the liberals. Liberal is a kind of swear word or aspersion that people are throwing around a lot, and they're doing it in the name of like a militant anti-imperialist leftism, right? We see this all over the place. Perhaps the one big symptom is the strange currency of Lasordo, of this dead Italian Marxist whose works are appearing in English translation and being championed by various leftists online, Gabriel Rockhill, perhaps mostly he's writing like prefaces and the like. But people like Daniel Tudd are doing reading groups or have done reading groups on Lasordo's work. Mm-hmm. So there is this old specter of anti-imperialism that comes back, and it's strangely tied to the Palestinian question, as though obviously the Palestinian question is like settler colonialism. It's framed as that, but it goes hand in hand with, I think, a real crisis about what to do. Obviously the DSA is an attempt, for all their faults, certainly the old Jacobin project, prior to the DSA championing Bernie Sanders and really kind of becoming Democrats, running people in, for Congress, like AOC. Before that, there was a question of like neo-Kautskyism in the West, right? It goes, the millennial project of like trying to rebuild a left in the core of capitalism. And now this is, it's good that we never did that, because it just would have been, the white left. It would have been the aristocracy of labor. These are imperialist countries, and somehow labor in the first world is bought off, right? And what I wanted to raise is the question of what that old idea really was about, and how it raises questions that can only be faced if there were a mass movement for socialism in the first world. Right? That it's a question that arises, or that arose historically in the context of the crisis of European socialism in the First World War. And that's a very, and obviously it's associated with Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks in particular. Not only them, but, Bukharin, Zinoviev, Lenin's sort of young proteges in the Bolshevik Party, and of course Lenin himself, in the context of World War I. And so we get these, this notion that those arguments are somehow still good coin to work with. And, I think I think the theory is both interesting and defensible in its own terms, and largely irrelevant to the tasks of the present. And the last thing I'll say, Doug, is we get into this sociology tendency on the left, right? Turning Marxism into like fake social science, where people try to determine who is and who isn't a member of the working class, who is who's petty bourgeois, who's PMC, who's like this whole it's just fake sociology run amok. That's very non-political. And so one of the things that you get is a sociology of like the labor aristocracy, right? Like, well, this is the layer of, these workers are bought off, and that's why they think what they think, right? Rather than understanding things, as political tasks to work through. So that's what I wanted to, I thought that it might follow nicely from our discussions of political economy, which have sort of the same, fake character or virtual character.
Now, you sent me an interview with Gregory Rockhill, and John Bellamy Foster. In the monthly Gabriel, I'm sorry, Gabriel Rockhill, and that's in the monthly review with Foster. And I want to turn to that in a moment, but before I do, just you mentioned that the theory of the labor aristocracy had a particular meaning. It was a particular kind of critique of the working class movement in the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. And I if you could you describe to me how Lenin would use the term labor aristocracy, and who he was referring to, and what he thought created a labor aristocracy?
Right. So I believe it's in Imperialism itself, Lenin's writing, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, where he addresses like the background of it, where Engels uses this category of where he says basically the working class of England is bourgeoisified, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked in the past, I think the show before last, when we were talking about my books,
Mm-hmm.
about how England never really had revolutionary socialism, right? And now this was a real issue, right? It is a real issue historically, that the English working class was led politically. It was very strong in its union organization,
Mm-hmm.
but it was led politically by the liberals, for the night over the course of the 19th century. And so, they were represented by, essentially Gladstone. And for that reason, they're not socialists. And so Engels, of course, remarks upon this living in England. And, it has to do with the fact that there's really no living legacy of Chartism. This important working class movement that was very inspiring and central to the um, early thinking of Marx and Engels as a mass political movement amongst the English working class, uh, that really never is reconstituted. No one really claims its legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Bonapartism in England cashes out Chartism in terms of the demand for suffrage and the like. Most of the elements of the charter are one, or certainly the suffrage element was one. And in the way that Louis Bonaparte vindicates the demand for universal suffrage in France, and Bismarck creates a kind of universal suffrage democracy under the Kaiserreich. And so that's the background of it. And Lenin takes up this question. And there's also language, the phrase itself comes from Daniel de Leon, the American socialist. And the way that Lenin's using it is he's trying to get at the crisis of Marxism. Why socialists are supporting capitalist governments in World War I. Most obviously, the SPD in Germany. The famous, the notorious crisis of European Marxism. The greatest party that's ever existed in Europe, the Socialist Democratic Party, dedicated to socialist revolution, supporting the government in its war effort in 1914. And Lenin, and of course, this happens elsewhere. So the question of working class support for capitalism, right? The question of revisionism in that sense, right? That Marxism, well, socialist parties, but even those that profess Marxism, become the strongest pillar of support for capitalism, right? That the question of this for Lenin is actually not surprising, right? Because capitalism ultimately is rooted in the proletarian condition, right? And so what happens is, that he's trying to explain this from 1914 to 1917. And there's some background, of course, like World War I is understood as imperialist in a specific sense, right? So we have the everyday kind of sense of imperialism. as
Mm-hmm.
colonialism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which isn't actually Marx and Engels' conception. We talked about this before, that really imperialism is a synonym for Bonapartism. There's imperialism without colonies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not the presence or absence of overseas colonies isn't the imperialism question per se.
Mm-hmm.
But the war appears as a fight for colonial markets. No, that's really not the whole Marxist understanding,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a very widespread liberal understanding that Marxists are engaged with critically. And so so Lenin writes, and Lenin's lieutenants like Bukharin and Zinoviev write works in World War I where they talk about how a section of the working class, the aristocracy of labor, is the basis in the working class for the imperialist policies of their government, including their war efforts. Now, what I would say about it, that the first thing to understand is that what they're talking about is something political. They're talking about the leadership of the working class, and especially they refer to labor bureaucrats, people like Noska and Scheidemann in Germany, right, who are important leaders of the SPD, who are, on the right with respect to the war question in 1914. And so the question of the labor lieutenants of capital has to do with how the working class comes to offer to openly offer political support for capitalism.
Right. I recall that when I first was getting involved with socialists in the 90s, when I was a young man, I would hear the leaders in the Socialist Action Group rail that the problem was not the workers, but the leadership of the workers, and I hear an echo of that in what you're describing now. That the reason the struggle for socialism failed was because of the betrayal of the workers by their leaders, would be another way of putting it.
Right. I think the way that Lenin's putting it is, in effect that, it has to do with, look, we have to operate within, like the working class has a natural and understandable commitment to capitalism, right? They work, right?
Right.
So the economic struggle of workers is a school for socialism. It's a school for revolutionary socialism, but it's also a school for non-revolutionary socialism, right? If in the economic struggle, you learn that you need the boss to stay in business, that you're committed to preserving capitalism, that you're committed to delivering a efficient workforce to the boss. So, because otherwise he won't be able to stay in business. And so the contradictions in the proletarian condition are ones that workers, of course, discover in their everyday participation in the workers' movement for socialism, including in their economic struggle. And in World War I, of course, the capitalist ministers are making overtures to the working class and how important it is for the working class to serve the country in its time of need, and that we're going to have to really pour kerosene on this economy, and we're going to need the workers, all men on deck for the nation. And of course, that means great job security, but we can't be having any strikes because of the needs of the nation and the nation being in peril. so leaders of the workers in Germany famously said, look, workers aren't some like vagabond group that like don't belong anywhere. They have a country, right? And we're German workers. Um, you know, Revolutionary socialists, of course, will ultimately say the working class has no country.
Right.
With Marx and Engels from the Communist Manifesto, right? And so that kind of division appeared in 1914. I think that for Lenin, it is a political struggle. The problem when people might have been saying that in the 90s is, the first elements aren't being addressed. Like, obviously there's a problem with leadership when there's no socialist party at all.
Right.
Like that's a big problem. That's like the equivalent of the British workers being led by the liberals, except the British workers did have the example of European and American workers and socialist parties, and there was some struggle for the independence of the working class in England, of course, that led to the ILP and debates, shall we say, within the Labour Party after its formation early on. So we just have a default understanding that, of course, the working class is just another constituency within capitalist politics. Right? We don't have the very assumptions that someone, for Lenin, the problem is a much more advanced problem. Right. Where socialism politically with its parties and its vast organizational, multifaceted forms of political, of working class political expression and activity, that's becoming the basis of socialism, right? That Marxism could prove to be not the great scourge of the ruling class and the enemy of capitalism, but the ultimate resource of capitalism, right? That Marxism created the movement that will serve as the basis for putting down the revolution and preserving capitalism, which is exactly what happened in Germany, right? And so what people like Rockhill and John Bellamy Foster in that conversation, what they want to ignore with their discussion of Western Marxism and how the Western Marxists have abandoned, by which they mean a bunch of intellectuals, above all the Frankfurt School, but the French, everyone from Merleau-Ponty and Sartre to the so-called French fries, Foucault and Baudrillard and Deleuze and the rest, Althusser, the Lacanianized French intellectual, all of it's just thrown together as Western Marxism. And their problem is that they've abandoned, politics. They've abandoned the working class struggle for socialism. And it's like, yeah, but there's no party for socialism.
Right.
In the West, like this is not a condition that these intellectuals have themselves created.
Right? As I was reading the interview, I wrote down a few things, and I want to echo what you just said. And because I wrote it down, I wrote, there's so much to disagree with in nearly every line. To begin with, let's take Foster's claim that in the work of the leading luminaries of the Frankfurt School and much of the post-war French and British theoretical Marxism, the tendency to withdraw from political economy in favor of cultural analysis, as well as a critical dismissal of many, if not all, real-world socialist state-building projects took hold. And I wrote, okay, so there's an obvious conflation here of the French, British, and German schools of Marxism. If you take, let's say the French would be represented by Althusser, he does turn towards
I mean,
critiquing
obviously,
ideological.
these things don't take a national character, but there are national inflections of
Right. I
Marxism.
mean,
Go ahead.
he's trying to put a label based on the nationalities, and there are different people in every nation. But Althusser, for example,
Hmm.
does turn toward critiquing ideological state apparatuses and opposes Hegelian dialectics, but not out of a desire to ignore imperialism or shun real-world socialist state-building projects. He was a member of the PCF. He defended the Soviet project into the 60s and remained true even after the secret speech. And his emphasis on ideology and state power was a matter of breaking from understanding capitalism as something created and recreated within society. He embraced the state and the Soviet Union precisely through ditching dialectics. The point I was making is that what I go on to say actually is that what they are ignoring was that the change. And Rockhill does it later. Rockhill describes a history of socialism through World War I and World War II, and places the blame on the decadence for the decadence of the Western Marxists on the defeat that is established in World War II, but not really a defeat. He describes it as a split between those in the West aligned with the imperialist power of the United States and those in the East aligned with the anti-fascist power of the Soviet Union, ignoring both the fact that the Soviets and the United States were aligned in World War II and were both decisively involved in defeating, fascism. Ignoring also the fact that after the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union took up fascist and Nazi projects and literal Nazis into their state apparatus. Why can he ignore all these things? It's because he ignores the defeat of socialism as a political party that happened in World War One, that happened through World War One. And so that's what I wanted to echo. But he does. I mean, he can. There's a lot of conflation and a lot of obscurantism in this interview, and you're right. They're ignoring politics, and to say that they're ignoring politics means that they're ignoring the fact that there was a political power that was socialist in Europe. That there was there was a Second International. There was the SPD. These things existed as struggling for
Right.
socialism.
I mean, so this gets back to like our discussions of like Henrik Grossman. I'll put it take it in this direction.
Mm-hmm.
What is, obviously, as you introduced me, who am I? I'm a founder of Platypus, and where do we take? What are our touchstones? Right, our touchstones are the projects that highlight the crisis of the left. Right, so Trotskyism on the one hand, the Frankfurt School on the other.
Mm-hmm.
And someone like Grossman represents. Grossman was a member of the Frankfurt School,
Mm-hmm.
and so already going back to 1924, when the Frankfurt School was founded, before Horkheimer takes over.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question as to what the role of effete intellectuals, intellectuals who, have been trained in European, gymnasia, highly educated people, people with PhDs, people like Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin, right? These were highly educated people. Right? So there had been an earlier kind of Marxist like Lenin and Luxemburg who had been effete intellectuals, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that they could, they were trained, educated from their privileged backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
Lenin's father had a non-inheritable, title from the Tsar. Right, he was an aristocrat, but his son wasn't going to inherit the title. Right, it was by virtue of being a high-ranking bureaucrat. And so Lenin was a privileged young man who would have excelled in whatever he chose to do. He had all the tools, and he chose to be a Marxist, and as did someone like Rosa Luxemburg, and they wrote dissertations about the emergence of industrial capitalism in Poland and in Russia. Those are the first books of Luxemburg and Lenin, respectively. Someone like Grossman is very much from the same mold, a little bit younger, like Bukharin and Zinoviev. He's a product of the revolution of 1905. He's radicalized at that time. Mm-hmm. He lived in the world of the Second International. And he's a guy who can read Marx and understand all of Marx's crazy little references and in-jokes and his Latin tags and his tossed off French and Italian and all the rest of it. He's a bookish guy, who walks with a silver-tipped cane and likes nice leather gloves and, has a proper hat on. He's a bourgeois intellectual associated with the socialist workers movement. Mm-hmm. And these people increasingly had no place in party life in the 1920s. Right? There aren't these intellectuals who are in the party who are writing for, like Karl Kautsky and Luxemburg and Lenin and these people in theoretical journals. Right? It's an environment that, by virtue of the historical circumstances, other people are thrown into leadership. Right. Mm-hmm. And there's, it's a bit more bare knuckled. Mm-hmm. Right. And so they're retreating and mm-hmm. creating something called the Frankfurt School, right? Creating something called the Institute for Social Scientific Research, blah, blah, blah. Right. So and when Horkheimer comes along in 1929 and onward, right, he's increasingly theorizing this situation. Mm-hmm. Right. If socialism involves the merger of, effectively bohemian intellectuals, radicalized bohemian intellectuals who are carrying the ideas of socialism, the merger of those people with the working class, right? Mm-hmm. If that's what these mass political parties are, right? They're the merger of intellectuals and the working class. And of course, the workers can become intellectuals in the context of that merger. Right. Right. In that merger, the distinction between intellectuals and workers is potentially and aspirationally dissolved into the category of comrade. Mm. Right. But that's breaking down, and that's not a function of the rotten choices made by intellectuals. Right. That's a function. So there are other examples like Karl Korsch, Gerd Lukács, mm-hmm. right? These people in the 1920s and 30s. And ultimately, from that coarsened and sort of bare knuckle and street fighting and very extreme condition of basically trying to conduct an orderly retreat from the heights of 1917 to 1919 mm-hmm. to a condition where we can again rebuild towards the revolutionary project in the way that, for instance, the left had done after the 1905 revolution, right? They had gone through a revolution and ultimately a defeat, but there were lessons of the revolution, right? That the experience of 1905 was enabling further development. That's what people were trying to do in the 1920s. That's what Lenin had argued for in left-wing communism and infantile disorder. Right, we need to conduct an orderly retreat so that we preserve our forces. Right, that's why a successful retreat is a really important maneuver. Right, just because you're defeated doesn't mean that you've lost the war. Right, and you can become hardened and steeled and experienced. The defeat can be the stepping stone to victory, and that's the attempt to be made in the 20s. And that collapses. And the name of that collapse in terms of in terms of the abandonment of that project internally to socialism, the name for that is Stalinism. Right? Stalinism is the embrace of defeat, right? Calling defeat victory, and thereby eliminating the possibility of building upon it, developing class consciousness on the basis of the defeat. And so in the West, so the ultimate collapse of the left, of course, takes place in the 20s and 30s in Europe, and the rise of fascism and the Second World War completes the process to the point of the actual physical extermination of the left. Right, in the continent of Europe, which is to say in the heartland of socialism going back to the 19th century. And Rockhill and Foster would have us believe that that's no big deal. Right. Or in the end, we defeated the Nazis. Right. It's like, right. In the end, we defeated the Nazis standing on a smoking ruin historically. Right. Right. And so
But what do you make of my objection that
in that sense, fascism won?
Right. Well, I was going to say of my objection that not only did the Soviet Union defeat fascism, but the United States was instrumental in that as well, and that after the war they both took up fascist and Nazi elements into their own states in various ways.
Right.
Most directly, just for the scientific development of missiles and rockets and things like that, but which became necessary because of the defeat of socialism and of the because that is a counter-revolutionary move to develop nuclear weapons and long-range missiles and all of that, right? I mean, in both
Sure.
parties. Yeah.
I mean, I obviously, Trotsky thinks that there's the need to break with the Third International. Why does he want to try to build a new international? Because the communists have allowed fascism to come to power. Right. The revolutionary perspective is that communism didn't defeat fascism. Communism ushered fascism into power. Right. That's the real argument. Right. The real argument is that the fascists did the work of Stalinists in defeating the revolutionary impulse within socialism. They're doing the same work that he's doing in the purge trials and in the purging of parties around the world in the 1930s, that he's doing in the Spanish Civil War, right? In leading the Spanish Republicans to defeat, right? So Stalinism is the organization of defeat. That's what it is, right? It's not the organization of victory,
right?
And we know that because the so-called defeat of fascism was not revolutionary, right? 1945 is not like in the 1950. The post-war period is not a revolutionary period in in Europe, unless you believe the setting up of the Eastern Bloc governments, right, of worker states in the East is revolutionary, right? That doesn't mean that you're apologizing for American imperialism, right? The point is not that, right? These people think in terms, so someone like Rockill thinks that you can find your politics by finding out who the FBI thinks is a problem, right? The right doesn't tell us how to understand the left,
No.
right, and so
well, sometimes it does, but it's always a tragedy. It's always a disaster when our own dirty laundry is dealt with by the right rather than by other leftists. But I'll put that aside. But do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
The right's always going to make the most of our failures.
Right, right. But I was reminded when as you were talking of C. Wright Mills' letter to a New Left, which I think at least has a glimmer of the realization that you're expressing in it, where he describes the deadening quality of life in the West and the East, and the necessity to develop a new left, which is really kind of the same impulse that Trotsky had much earlier on, right?
Right, and so there's a widespread recognition in the 50s and early 60s that we don't need to revitalize the Democratic Party, right? We don't need to we don't need to build up the working class so we can get Democrats elected. We need a new left, right? Like the campaign for socialism that you're engaged in, right? It was variously understood, but the impulse is to rebuild the independent socialist left, right? We've talked about this before, right? In America, the civil rights movement was viewed as an opportunity to build a new left. It wasn't just about, ultimately, it's not just about ending Jim Crow, right? It's about using the struggle against Jim Crow to substantially transform American politics, right? And in particular, to break with the self-subordination of the working class to the capitalist political parties, right? It's not just about creating a democratic party on the basis of Southern blacks and the Northern working class. Right. It's about creating the opportunity for an alternative to the capitalist duopoly.
Right.
So, yeah.
And that alternative can't be like a plurality of capitalist parties, that will throw in the Greens and Libertarians and what have you, but an actual socialist party.
Right. And so people, so the Trotskyists are a wound, they're the reminders that Lenin was a part of a world party for socialism with its center in the core states of socialism, not uniformly, didn't have the organization that we wanted, American socialism. All socialism everywhere could have been stronger. It could have been stronger in Germany. It sure as hell could have been stronger in England and in France and in the United States. But there was a world movement for socialism, and the Bolshevik Revolution was part of the strategy, the understood strategy of the Second International. Going back to 1905, that a revolution in Russia could be the trigger for a revolution in Germany. That they didn't necessarily have have to have a war preceding it. The defeat in the war wasn't a part of the strategy, but right? The catastrophe of the war, of course, was not something that people willed into being as part of the master plan or something, but Lenin nevertheless takes the occasion of the crisis and the self-discrediting of capitalism and the bloodbath of World War I to try and fulfill the revolutionary project of the Second International. And he has comrades across Europe. And it does spark revolution across Europe, certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, Italy as well. And that ultimately fails. And that ultimate failure, of course, for Lenin isn't a verdict on Marxism.
Right.
As he says, well, we tried, this way to climb the mountain. Right. We tried to scale the mountain this way, and now we're going to back down this mountain, and sometimes backing down the mountain after you've discovered that your trail doesn't lead where you'd hoped might be more treacherous than your ascent, right? Famous discussion in Lenin.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going, the top of the mountain is socialism conquered in France, Britain, and the United States. The socialism in the United States from the time of, you can read it in Trotsky's Results and Prospects in 1906.
Right.
And in Kautsky's writings to American workers in the wake of 1905. That's the goal, right? Is Gabriel Rockhill and John Bellamy Foster, are they talking about that? Right? Are they,
I want to take the devil's advocate position for just a second, okay?
Sure.
And go back to labor aristocracy and see if I can articulate this properly. The idea that the revolution should begin in the United States and in Europe.
Not necessarily begin, but end.
Okay, end there. That there needs to be a revolutionary movement in these places. I think hinges on the fact that, for instance, today, the United States, and we can see it happen, it's becoming more and more evident right this moment, that the fact, particularly the United States, has such a hegemonic imperialist power. Like it hinges on the fact of the way in which the United States dictates to the working class what is going to happen and how things are going to be arranged. It's not an infinite power from the state of the United States, but the productive capacity of the United States, the power, it really is, I think, the power of the U.S. workers that then has taken hold around the world. So we presuppose that is necessary, a necessary precondition for the reaching of the top of the mountain. And the danger is that we would work to protect U.S. power on that basis.
Oh,
that we would become okay. All right. Good. Well, that's right. I think, the argument that might be made by the Rockhills of the world, that we would, by wanting to have a revolution in the United States on that basis, we are becoming aligned with the U.S. capital in the process. So address that.
I mean, look, if there was a socialist movement in the United States, and certainly if there was a socialist revolution in the United States, global inequality might be increased, right? It's not that it would immediately address that problem, right? Global inequality is, I guess I would say that I don't agree exactly that the United States, as you put it, dictates to the working class, like internationally. What I would say is that if we're talking about American hegemony, right? Yes, the United States has played active counter-revolutionary roles, say vis-a-vis the Civil War. in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But overwhelmingly, if we're talking about American hegemony post 1945, we're talking about the stabilization of a post-socialist world.
Right.
And it's not right. The Cold War is not it's not the revolution versus the counter-revolution.
Right. I agree with that.
Right.
I mean, remember earlier before I start recording, I said one of my ticks is that I say I agree with that in interviews, and then I just did it. Keep going.
Well, this is basic,
Yeah, right.
This is basic for the kids to understand.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that Rockhill and Foster claim is that decolonization is revolutionary.
Mm.
And they even talk about it as ending imperialism, which is ludicrous. I mean, nobody thinks that. Not the revolutionaries in the global South, right? So they say in the article for this month in the monthly review that you quoted from earlier, they say the revolutionary Marxism of the global South has not simply interpreted the world, but has fundamentally altered it by breaking the chains of imperialism. What are we talking about, right? Decolonization is the breaking of the chains of imperialism. This is where the issue of what is imperialism is really important.
Right.
Right. Decolonization is a project of strengthening the global Bonapartist state.
Right.
It's making capitalism adequate to the post-war world. Right. That's what it is. It isn't a blow against the empire. This is lunacy, and the United States supports it. Of course it supports. It's an elemental element of U.S. hegemony. Decolonization of the European empires and the decolonization of the American empire. I mean, the U.S. gets out of the Philippines quite earlier than the British get out of India. And so, obviously the United States, this is what, and this, by the way, is where FDR and Stalin agree, right? That, look, de Gaulle and Churchill are going to be disappointed in the arrangements that we're going to make after the war, right? Because we're going to dismantle these empires. So this is, the creation of small, weak capitalist countries is not, with the support of the bourgeoisie in those countries, is not revolutionary. It's not counter-revolutionary, right? There's no question of a revolution in some sense, but it is an integral part of the reconstitution, the reorganization of capitalism, right? It's like, was the achievement of global neoliberalism revolutionary or counter-revolutionary? It wasn't either one. It was just a reorganization of capitalism in the context of overall historical regression in the absence of socialism, right? So that's what I would say is that, obviously their position depends on the claim that it's upward and onward for the socialist revolution, right? That the revolution is still unfolding, right? History, the necessity of socialism is just fulfilling itself. Socialism can be seen in all of these historical developments. And, what I would say is that progress is the appearance that the reconstitution of capitalist domination takes. The ultimate argument for capitalism is what it calls progress. Like progressivism is capitalism. right? This progressive Marxism is capitalism. It is the real legacy of revisionism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
That these people make these like big militant claims, right, about how they're on the side of the plucky third world revolutionaries, and these decadent, well-to-do professors like Adorno are bought off,
Uh-huh.
right? But they're the undeceived and uncompromising revolutionaries. No, they are the argument for capitalism.
I mean, yeah, I think that the other thing that I discovered reading that interview that I kind of found galling was that they claimed they tend to claim that this Western Marxism has dominated left politics in some way in the United States or anywhere. Like, I mean, who in the West since, let's say, 1970 has been, pushing the agenda of Adorno or the Western Marxists, other than the Platypus Affiliated Society that sprang up recently? I mean, there's no one. The dominant ideology of the Democratic Party is the very anti-imperialism that they are espousing. It is nothing else than that. So I don't see, and that is defined, the Weather Underground and where the SDS ended up was very much aligned with the very thinking that they're claiming is, Eastern or from the South or something. This is not
right. So Daniel Tutt did an interview with Russell Jacoby, and
I want to talk to him. Yeah,
and we're lucky to have Russell Jacoby still alive and cogent, a veteran of 1970s, creative Marxist intellectualism. Right? The best that would, one of the more interesting currents was one that he was closely associated with around the journal Telos in the 70s. And, he's like, what are you talking about that the left is like weak on anti-imperialism? That's all that it was in the 60s and 70s was the anti-Vietnam War movement, right? The key knows, right, that the dominant strain coming out of the 60s is Maoism in the United States. It's not peripheral, it's central.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was the same thing in 68 in Paris, the Maoists were mostly the dominant force. I like to, Gen Xers like me like to pretend it was all Guy Debord or something, but it wasn't at all. It was very much a Maoist moment, go on.
Right. Right. And similarly, not all post-war French intellectualism is like Lacanianized and Foucauldianized, right? There's right. Interesting, French Trotskyism that is off the radar for these guys. Ultimately flawed, Castoriadis, Claude Lefort, others. But that's not, look, Gabriel Rockhill is someone, he's our generation, right? He went to graduate school. They handed him all this so-called French theory, this academic concept, right? Theory, right? So this is what he's preoccupied with, the theory industry, French theory, because this is what he knows, right? It's like he's discovering Marxism, in the last 10 years of his life or something, and realizing that all the stuff that he dedicated his life to has nothing to do with it or is opposed to it. And it's like, well, I could have told you that.
Right.
But it's not my fault that Foucault's conservative. But you're absolutely right that, why are they talking about Adorno? I mean, they're talking about Adorno because of Chris Catrone. Adorno's Marxism and the argument with Adorno and aligning Adorno with the dissenting strain in the 20th century the negative strain of Marxism, Trotskyism, other currents coming out of the left opposition. Of course, dissident strains within mainstream communism and Maoism, right? It's not that those traditions are devoid of interest. Maoism was a way in which the discontent with Soviet Marxism was explored, for sure. I think that that's the primary milieu that I would put like Moshe Pistone in. Would be a kind of creative Maoism in America and Germany. I don't know how self-conscious Moshe was about that, but that's ultimately what his work has a lot of kind of the same thought shapes and thought figures. I would say like Chris Catrone and Platypus. Like, I'm not even sure that like Rockhill knows why he's upset about Adorno, or if he knows that he's upset about Chris, or if John Bellamy Foster. But the only reason anyone's talking about Adorno on the left and so upset about it, and slanderously and extremely on the basis of the thinnest of evidence, claiming that they're somehow materially bought off, right? That you can explain, the thought of the Frankfurt School. For instance, they talk about how some of them worked for the U.S. government during the war for the OSS. And it's like, well, they're just being good communists.
Right. I mean, come on.
If anything, that's the Stalinist wing of the Frankfurt School doing that, in the sense that, they're supporting the Soviet Union by supporting the American ally.
You have to forget that the United States and the Soviet Union were allies in order to point to that as a great betrayal.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. You have to, in the one moment say, oh, the Soviet Union defeated fascism, and then the next say, how dare they work against fascism with the United States? I mean, it's right. That's crazy making.
It's really strange, and it's, look, Foster is, he's the editor of the Monthly Review, which is a venerable old organ of communism and fellow travelers that takes the Maoism turn in the Sino-Soviet split. It's associated with like the Guardian, the National Guardian, an old newspaper out of New York, that represented kind of mainstream communist opinion that took the Maoist turn with the New Left. And, he knows his tradition, right? And he's a he's a boomer Marxist. He says some things.
Kind of younger boomer, I think, isn't he? He's like he's not
on the younger side. I think he's 71.
Okay.
But in the years, I think he was born in 53, right? So he's a boomer. If the boomers started at like 48 or 49, so he's a veteran of the debates of the 70s. He's a veteran of a much higher level of debate. He was formed by a higher level of debate than, in some sense, we've ever seen on the left. And so, he's kind of gently correcting Rockhill throughout that discussion.
And Rockhill's ignoring him.
And he's ignoring him. He thinks that they're agreeing when they're not agreeing throughout. But it's, I think intellectually it's irresponsible not to mark the disagreement.
Right.
That Foster should have said, well, this is the point of dispute between us, so that young people can learn. I don't think it's good to create false consensus. So he's talking about So he criticizes Rockhill for some of his formulations. Like Rockhill tries to say, well, the Western Marxists are the intellectual correlate of the aristocracy of labor, right? These are if there's in the merger formula, if it's workers and intellectuals, then there's an aristocracy of workers and there's an aristocracy of socialist intellectuals, right? Mm-hmm. And they, like the working class, are bought off with the scraps of imperialism, right? This is what Rockhill says in this article. And
which is miles away from what Lenin was talking about, right?
Miles away, because Lenin's not talking about like high wage workers,
right?
Like high wage workers, like relatively secure, well organized workers, were some of the most revolutionary workers in 1917 to 1919. Right? It's not the case that, obviously, like people who are more vulnerable might be more susceptible to the, perceived or real short-term benefits of supporting the capitalists.
Right.
Right. Obviously, when you're on strike and you're trying to keep out the scabs from crossing the picket line, right? Mm-hmm. It's the well-to-do unionized workers with jobs who are trying to keep out the lumpenized scabs from the workplace. Really, like these are basic lessons, right?
Right.
And it's very basic stuff, and and history shows that it's not the case that you can simply correlate militancy with deprivation.
Of course, right?
Yeah. But that's not clear to these people, right? It's not clear to these people. It's certainly not clear that you can make that argument in terms of the global North and the global South.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And the difference between the global North and the global South in terms of deprivation is staggering, right? Obviously, the poor and working, the masses of the underdeveloped world are much more desperate, right? Much more immiserated than workers in the first world. But poverty, the American poverty line is like 23,000 ish.
Yeah.
The World Bank's poverty line is like $4 a day, right?
Right.
It's just it's a different order of magnitude, right? Obviously, we know this, and no one is denying those vast inequalities. I would deny that those vast inequalities can be explained in quasi-moral terms of like plunder or theft, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's a deep misunderstanding of the geography of capitalism, the social geography that we see. I don't think it's a pure function of colonialism, right? I don't. There's all kinds of, they get into all kinds of stuff, right? Like internal colonialism. They try to explain the poverty in the American South by talking about internal, no, it's just not going to do, really. In all seriousness, it doesn't work. Losing your colonies doesn't make you poor.
Right.
When the Europeans decolonized, they didn't become poorer. They became much, much richer, along with the rest of the first world in the post-1945 world, right? So when Britain lost its empire, the workers started to own houses for the first time, or at least have stable housing and
rent control or something like that. Yeah.
Rent control and, multiple changes of clothes and, 2 or 3 extra pairs of shoes for the first time. Right.
Right.
And that's not, and that's not on the backs of the global South's working masses. That's a deep misunderstanding. It's not even that being exploited less.
I feel like this came up in a recent workshop, actually, that there's a mercantilist understanding of the world that attaches itself to the anti-imperialist left, like as if all the world's wealth is fixed in place. We have it all in our vaults. It's like in Fort Knox. And then, the West goes and steals bars of gold or currency from the global South.
Right.
And
so the wealth of England comes, from the plunder of India and the slave trade, and the wealth of the United States was created by slavery. This is what you get, right? And this is obviously not Marxism.
Marx does say that slavery was vitally important to the development of Europe and the United States in terms of suppressing the workers and proletarianizing those places, doesn't he?
Right, but the wealth of the United States dwarfs the wealth of the rest of Central and South America. And
right.
Those countries are slave countries too. Brazil has a lot more slaves than the United States. Why is Brazil not the wealthiest country in the New World? The wealth of the United States comes from the struggle for freedom and the industrialization of the United States, the struggle against slavery. Yes, obviously, as a point about like the rise of bourgeois society, right? If you're talking about the rise of bourgeois society, you're going to talk about the Atlantic world, and an elemental part of that is the slave trade. Right, it is the development of plantations in the New World, in the Caribbean, in the southern states, to a lesser degree in the southern states, what becomes the United States, in Brazil, etc. And a lot of the North, of course, is going to feed that trade, literally, with the growth of crops, with the shipbuilding industry, etc. A lot of the merchant capital, of course, is coming from England, right? It's a complex situation, but the revolution of 1776, creating an enclave of free labor in the New World, abolishing slavery across the northern states, is absolutely central to the freedom of the United States. I mean, obviously, the abolition of slavery has already taken place before 1776 in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. It was never the fundamental basis of the mode of production there. Free labor was, and free labor was, of course, the basis of the Industrial Revolution. Right. It has to be, right? And so, what do we? And colonialism is an impediment to the development of bourgeois society. Right? Adam Smith thought so. The industrialists of Manchester thought so. They all know it, right? The empires in India and Africa were, the most backward elements in English society. They were the aristocracy, and the gentry that wanted these things. The working class isn't in favor of it, right? And they're not benefiting from it, right? They, from their own point of view, right, from capitalism's point of view. I mean, this is what I study, right? I mean, this is what I just flat out know this, right? The liberals of England are like, why can't the Indians buy anything? Right? Why are the Indians such poor customers? Like, this fucking empire is impoverishing these people. It's refusing to build roads. It fails to build railroads. It doesn't develop the economy. They point it all out. They say, look, in Argentina, we don't have any imperial power in South America. These are free countries. And the Argentinians buy 10 times more of our industrial products per capita than the Indians do. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So what good is our empire? Right. Our goods will find their market because they're cheaper. Right. We don't need to control. The British didn't need to like force the Indians. They didn't. It was free trade.
Right.
They're not like, go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to say, like, the vision of the so-called anti-imperialist left, which is really reifying imperialism, not opposing it, I think, but is so mean and limited and
sub-bourgeois.
It just rejects the notion that creative production, free association, even under the contradictory conditions of capitalism, can develop better conditions and freedom. That it just totally wants to obscure that fact and ignore it.
Right. I mean, that the labor of man mobilizing the forces of nature, harnessing the forces of nature to the purposes of overcoming scarcity is
right.
That this is not better achieved in conditions of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is obvious. Right. The problem isn't that we have created this. Of course, the productivity itself, the freedom itself, the capacity to overcome scarcity itself is experienced as a catastrophe by the rest of the world. Right. It's unequal exchange and these sorts of questions that creates the vast differences between the first world and the third world. Right. Mm-hmm. If it's like if Trump says we're going to like reshore production, right? We're going to we're not going to make, our shirts and our jeans in Bangladesh anymore. We're going to make them in America.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we were to do that, it would employ like 1/50th of the people that it employs in Bangladesh. The people of Bangladesh are already under the law of value in the sense that even if there isn't a first world textile factory, there could be.
Right.
And so those sweatshop workers have to be paid in such a way as to make it more profitable than to build that factory in the United States, which is to say to rebuild those factories in the United States. If we had factories built making textiles in the United States, we wouldn't have vast warehouses full of women with sewing machines.
Right.
We would have a roboticized factory that looked like, like a Honda plant in Georgia, right? Built, the day before yesterday. It would be monumentally efficient, and you would be paying the price of labor power in the United States. You'd be paying people what it costs to have the Ford F-150 in the house and the refrigerator and the Costco membership that it takes to be able to work in a textile factory. And so, that law of value hangs over the people of the developing world like the sword of Damocles. Of course it does. And it doesn't mean that the workers that could work in this, possible factory in the United States are exploiting the people of Bangladesh.
No.
Right? That's absurd. Right? They are desperate people looking for a job, looking to sell their labor power, and they're selling it at its value. They're not selling it above its value. They're selling it at what it takes.
Yeah.
We know this, right? Like if you're going to have workers who are going to mobilize hundreds of millions or billions of dollars worth of constant capital, right, that are going to be working with robots, of course they have to have an F-150 and a house and a Costco membership, right? Like they're going to be responsible for this, right? They're going to be identified with that plant. They're going to tell the boss if there's some steam coming out where it shouldn't be, or
Mhm.
whatever, right? They're going to be a unionized, highly productive, highly responsible labor force. They're not going to, get drunk and sabotage the machines, right? The other workers would stop them from doing that, right? Obviously, right?
Mhm.
And they would be clothing the world and
Right.
doing so on the basis of highly exploitative labor,
Yeah. Listen,
right?
I want to do another session with you in just a minute here.
Mm-hmm.
So let's wrap it up here. But thank you. This is hopefully a very educational podcast. I
Hope
think
so.
that the only thing that I think, and I probably will cut this part out, but just that you can say this until you're blue in the face, and it barely makes a dent. It doesn't seem to register with a lot of people right now, and maybe we can talk about why that is in the second half. So I'm going to end the recording.
That'd be
there.
interesting.
Yeah. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.